Hi, my name is Anya, and today Chewy, Chloe, and I are going to discuss dissociative disorders with a focus on the biology behind them. If you don't know a lot about dissociative disorders, that's totally fine. I'm about to give you some background on them and what groups them together. The three of us are college students at Whitworth University, and we put this podcast together for our biological psychology project. None of us are professionals, so definitely take the information we present with a grain of salt. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Dissociation is an experience of feeling detached from one's body, surroundings, or identity. It is the core symptom that ties together the dissociative disorders of the DSM-5. While we view it as a problem in and of itself, the dissociating brain would surely not agree, for dissociation is no mistake in the functioning of one's brain. It is a carefully cultivated coping mechanism intended to remove an individual from the experience of some stressor. In theory, it is something anyone can experience. Maybe you've had an experience where someone is telling you a story and you zone out for a minute or two and miss half the story. This is an example of mild dissociation, something anyone could experience. Of course, one or two such experiences is not going to land you a professional diagnosis. So what would? Let me break down each of the disorders for you. The first and perhaps most simple diagnosis is Depersonalization Derealization disorder, or DDD, which includes detachment from one's body or surroundings, but not their identity. It does not necessarily need to be both, but to warrant a diagnosis, the dissociation an individual experiences must disrupt their life somehow, and there must be no better diagnosis for the symptoms experienced. For example, for someone who experiences emotional numbness, which is often a feature of DDD, but does not experience any other dissociative symptoms, major depressive disorder may be more appropriate. On the other end of the spectrum is dissociative amnesia, in which an individual becomes disconnected from their identity via amnesia. Dissociation from one's identity often involves amnesia, but not always. I'll elaborate more on that in a minute. Unlike other forms of amnesia, dissociative amnesia is not necessarily associated with brain damage. More often than not, it is associated with trauma in one way or another. As such, it is often diagnosed with things like PTSD. An episode of dissociative amnesia can last for any period of time ranging from days to years, and the information forgotten can include events one has experienced, information about one's life such as their name, or both of these factors. The events forgotten can cover any period of time as well. Perhaps the most infamous disorder in this category is dissociative identity disorder, or DID, which was previously known as multiple personality disorder. As its previous name suggests, it is characterized by multiple personality states, or alters. The renaming of this disorder was meant to emphasize that people who have DID are not a single person with multiple personalities. They are a system of two or more individual people with their own memories, names, genders, and more, but they share a body. DID always involves dissociative amnesia. An individual who fits the criteria for DID but does not experience amnesia would be diagnosed with other specified dissociative disorder, or OSDD. The same goes for someone who does experience dissociative amnesia in the same way as someone with DID, but has less distinctive alters. For example, alters who all feel they are the same person, despite having distinct memories. All of these disorders are associated with trauma, usually childhood trauma, and in most cases repeated childhood trauma. This is why the brain develops such a severe coping mechanism, because the things these individuals have experienced as children were just too horrific to experience and remember like a fully aware individual. For this reason, it is important for others, such as myself, to accept these individuals, however weird they might seem at first. Because if anyone deserves love and kindness, it's childhood trauma victims. That aside, though, I'm awfully curious as to what the brain is doing during experiences of dissociation. For example, what hormones are being released? I'd like to pass the baton to Chewy to cover some of this information.
Thanks, Anya. Hey everyone, I'm Chewy, and today I'll provide more information about what neurobiologically is occurring during dissociative disorders, mainly during dissociative amnesia and depersonalization/derealization disorder. Let's begin with learning more about dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is the inability to recall events and information that normally should be remembered. We forget things from time to time. However, individuals with dissociative amnesia experience these lapses of memory to a greater extent than normal. For example, this disorder can last between a few days to years even, and the range of forgetfulness can be just a few minutes to even a decade. Isn't that crazy? When I first think of amnesia, I think of it as a negative consequence of like a huge car crash. However, it is not the case with dissociative amnesia. According to the DSM-5, it has psychological causes, such as psychological trauma. This is why it makes sense that dissociative amnesia works hand in hand with other psychological disorders, such as PTSD and dissociative identity disorder. In a few minutes, Chloe will describe more about dissociative identity disorder and related topics. For now, let's discuss how an individual with dissociative amnesia forgets memories. There are 3 subtypes of this disorder, which are localized, selective, and generalized. Localized dissociative amnesia involves the forgetting of an entire event or period of time. Selective amnesia involves the forgetting of a piece of an event. For example, imagine you're a veteran and you may remember that you fought in an excruciatingly challenging and traumatizing battle. However, you may not remember, unfortunately, a friend of yours that may have passed during that traumatic event. Much more rare is generalized dissociative amnesia, which involves the forgetting of your entire past. As past memories, aka retrograde memories, are the memories being impaired in dissociative amnesia. The brain regions associated with this behavior, the medial temporal lobe and diencephalon, are very impaired. The medial temporal lobe actually contains the hippocampus, which is linked to memory formation and recall. A particular part of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus helps us focus on stuff we need to remember, but which patients with dissociative amnesia may experience can be very negatively affected by trauma. On a positive note, since individuals with dissociative amnesia do not have cognitive nor intellectual impairments and memory, the disorder can be potentially reversed with proper treatment. Another dissociative disorder is depersonalization/derealization disorder, which I'll refer to as DDD for the rest of my description. Let's define a few things. What is depersonalization and derealization in psychological terms? Depersonalization are experiences of unreality or detachment from one's mind, self, or body. In contrast, derealization occurs when experiences of unreality or detachment from one's surroundings. As these terms are often present within the same experience, they're often and sometimes used interchangeably. DDD is the persistent feeling like a stranger to yourself or to your symptoms. The Trauma Disassociation Corporation outlines 5 symptoms associated with DD, which are 1. Numbness of emotions and bodily senses. 2. Detachment from self. 3. Things appearing unreal. 4. A distorted sense of time. And 5th, altered bodily perceptions. A compelling aspect of individuals with DDD is that they will confess they have a loss of emotions and estrangement from their surroundings, but they are aware that their perceptions are not a real representation of what's actually occurring around them. Although the neurobiological causes of this type of disorder remain quite elusive, many neuroimaging studies have been performed which have provided valuable insight. One such study is a 1998 study by researchers Sierra and Berrios, who proposed that symptoms of depersonalization may be associated with the disconnection of the corticolimbic brain system, involving the amygdala, anterior cingulate gyrus cortex, and prefrontal structures. Normally, the amygdala aids in emotional processing, which is why it is necessary for the appraisal of stress. However, increased activity in the medial frontal cortex appeared to dampen activity in the amygdala and marked decreased autonomic responses, which elicited a kind of shutting down mentality in the brain and the body. Lastly, let's explore what hormones may be involved in DDD. The hormone cortisol, which is often referred to as the stress hormone as it gets produced when the body is experiencing stress. Traumas unarguably elicit high levels of stress, which is why it makes sense to bring cortisol into the discussion of a trauma-related disorder such as DDD. In 2007, researcher Tomo Greisbeck and his colleagues established a strong association between individuals that ranked high on the depersonalization and derealization subscale of the dissociative experience scale and more pronounced cortisol responses compared to their counterparts. These findings don't support the claim that high cortisol levels will directly cause an individual to develop DDD. Instead, they show that people who already have symptoms of DDD appear to also have higher cortisol levels. Furthermore, it is important to remember the subjective nature of such associations. Social support, perception of emotional distress, environment, coping styles, and much more can impact these results. I hope you gained a better understanding of and greater empathy for individuals suffering from disorders such as dissociative amnesia and depersonalization/derealization disorder. Now I'll pass the mic to Chloe to talk about disorders related to identity and to wrap up our discussion for today.
Thanks, Chewy. Hey listeners, I'm Chloe, and I'm here to talk more about identity confusion and identity alteration disorders, as well as wrap up this podcast with a bow on top for the holidays. Now, to start us off, identity confusion is simply a struggle from within about your own sense of self or sense of identity. A blurred sense of self, if you will, which could include conflicting thoughts or even just uncertainty about those thoughts related to your identity. An example of this could be someone who has a hard time figuring out what their professional ambitions are, or even where to start to think about those, or even just defining what hobbies and interests they have in life that makes them happy. On the other hand, identity alteration is when somebody at times can act like a completely different person, and that could include having a different name. Now, those different identities can include different genders, different ages, different background history, and so on and so forth from the original person. Now, this could include finding personal possessions that they didn't know they even owned, or having no recollection of learning a specific skill. Someone with this type of dissociative disorder tends to also show signs and symptoms of having dissociative amnesia as well, which Chewy explained a little bit earlier. Now, there have been some brain imaging studies from the Amen Clinic that have shown that people who suffer from DID, or dissociative identity disorder, and other disorders tend to have less volume in their hippocampus, which is related to memory and learning, and our ability to remember and to learn new things, as well as having less volume in the amygdala, which is heavily associated with our feeling of fear and the fear response, as well as some other emotional responses. It's kind of interesting, right? So, in the past few minutes, you, as the lovely listeners you are, heard Anya explain what dissociative disorders are and how they can be carefully cultivated coping mechanisms that the brain does to take that individual person away from their stressor. And that these disorders are all associated with trauma of some sort, most of which stems from childhood trauma. Anya also went on to discuss how dissociative disorders on a spectrum from mild to severe, and that, unfortunately, in most cases of the mild symptoms will often go undiagnosed. Chewy then took the reins of this conversation even further with diving into symptoms of dissociative disorders that include dissociative amnesia, and how there are 3 types of amnesia one can experience, which include localized, selective, and generalized amnesia. She also discussed how dissociative depersonalization and how the symptoms could include a disconnection of the corticolimbic brain system. I wrapped up this podcast with talking about identity confusion, a battle within oneself that leads to uncertainty in their identity, as well as identity alteration, which can include 2 or more different personalities, different people living within one body. Now, I thank you all for your time and your listening ears. Hopefully you learned a thing or two as well. Now, as a disclaimer, we are by no means professionals, and if you feel like you fit these symptoms that we have explained above and have further questions about these, please seek out your local professional medical team. Thanks.